In 1996, a specific group from Spain's Guardia Common left on a dangerous mission to dig into the profundities of the Cueva Del Agua cavern that from the beginning seemed, by all accounts, to be only a straightforward water-filled cave drove by two bold and experienced cave jumpers. The group stretched past suggested boundaries, unwittingly making way for a succession of disturbing episodes. In the present video I will share different records from this cavern, every story more chilling than the last. Less caution is exhorted. Tales have been coursing inside the worldwide plunging local area about a cavern in Spain with a broad underground framework supposedly associated with nations overall, including far-off ones like China. This organization, comprising of underground waterways, vowed to be an exceptionally huge archaeological find if completely investigated and checked. Persuaded by this energy, various travelers have stretched the boundaries of the cavern, planning to be the first to make this notable disclosure. Anyway, this mission has demonstrated risky, and some have paid with their lives considering. These episodes, news groups have given broad inclusion, remembering the salvage endeavors for reaction. The specialists made a prompt move. They introduced cautioning signs at the cavern's entry and built walls to confine access anyway. These actions have not hindered determined jumpers and wayfarers. Thus, those courageous enough to gamble with entering the cavern, in spite of the expected dangers to their lives, have gotten through these hindrances, remembering chains and supports for the mid-1990s. S2 French jumpers died in the buckle under baffling conditions they wandered in, uninformed about the dangers, and vanished. A salvage endeavor was considered excessively hazardous and was cut short as the probability of extra fatalities was high. The remaining parts of these French jumpers were ultimately found years after the fact by different jumpers who wandered profound into the cavern, however, were sufficiently lucky to return. Shockingly, this disastrous occasion didn't stop others from investigating the cavern, yet supported further investigation. The cavern's allure is solid to such an extent that, as per occupants, gatherings of jumpers come consistently looking to explore its effectively shallow passages and arise securely anxious to share their encounters. However, not very many of them wandered profound into the cavern, roosted dubiously close to the fundamental street, close to El Mayon. The entry to Cueva Del Agua stands a door to an extraordinary cavern framework. The water inside isn't simply warm, it's practically hot, unnervingly, as yet making segments with sediment and mud. It parts into two particular areas, one a concise section driving towards the ocean that is straightforward to explore, and the other a rambling, more broad defeat tunneling profound into the mountain, around 3,281 ft, or around 1,000 mu, venturing to the furthest limit of this broad segment. Outrageous pioneers should explore a claustrophobic labyrinth of displays. In cave jumping, the difficulties and dangers are amplified outside the ability to understand of those familiar with typical cavern plunging, dissimilar to vast water, where the surface is dependably a departure course. Cave jumpers are gotten into a maze of obscurity, compelled to withdraw their way carefully to track down their direction back to somewhere safe. The most overwhelming part of cavern jumping is the perceivability, or rather the total absence of it in vision, being encircled by a thick darkness that you see nothing, even with a spotlight in your grasp directly before your cover. It's not simply restricted to perceivability, it's much the same as visual impairment. You can't see anything. At this peculiarity isn't select to caves. Wreck jumpers frequently experience comparative circumstances. However, in the thin bounds of a cavern, what is happening turns out to be dramatically more basic. A well-being line is a lifesaver in these circumstances. It's shocking how rapidly it can become entrapped and recall in this visual deficiency. Unraveling it is very hard. Cavern jumpers, consequently, are a variety separated, furnished with specific stuff and an outlook tuned to these outrageous conditions. Their gear is carefully picked and multiplied for overt repetitiveness. Tanks and controllers, CCs, and frequently 3 lights. Rather than only the typical 2, they convey additional covers wings and 2-fold bladder frameworks bounce reels mains markers. And bailout bottles the group's convention for. Exploring the cavern is exact the lead jumper, makes a plan dealing with the leap reels, and denoting the leave the last jumper should then perceive the right way on the exit plan. An errand muddled by the reality they didn't put the actual markers plunging with trusted and natural colleagues is fundamental in such conditions, yet past the physical and specialized difficulties lies a more slippery risk. The draw of investigation caverns can be hypnotizing, enticing jumpers to wander somewhat further, to investigate only another concealed corner. This enticement, and the way that jumpers should feel completely fine breathing effectively, makes a misguided feeling of safety. The draw of the obscure, the excitement of revelation, can cloud judgment, driving even experienced jumpers into hazard. This is the key justification for why many prepared jumpers avoid submerged caves. They comprehend the overwhelming shaft of these strange domains and the lamentable stories of the people who have capitulated to their charm. They realize that in the quiet, dark strides of a cavern, a jumper's most prominent difficulty is their own interest and craving for experience. A long time after the nerve-wracking occurrences at the Cueva Del Ua, the cavern's standing as a jumper's risky test was once more certified. This time, the jumper trapped in the cavern's deceptive hug was Antonio Pedro Martins Ardes, a 41-year-old family man and a representative at the CCO Antigua Plunging Foundation in Maria Antonio, known for his daring soul, had wandered into Cueva Del Agua with an arrangement to investigate its unknown segment solo. Aware of the dangers implied, having referenced to a companion the chance of him getting caught himself, however, he wasn't as concerned in light of the fact that he realized the cavern was loaded up with many air pockets while offering transitory shelter. These pockets represented a critical danger, particularly on the off chance that his air supply dwindled before salvage could show up. Regardless of being a plunge teacher, Antonio had underrated the cavern's intricacy and risk. This was his initial introduction to the cavern, so in fact testing and loaded with eccentric branch-offs when the crisis call was made well past them. Time Antonio ought to have returned. The exceptionally talented experts from the gas were gathered. Their main goal was to find and safeguard Antonio. The 2 gas jumpers entered the cavern anyway. Upon section, they were met with conditions that made even the straightforward demonstration of perusing their plunge watches unthinkable. The perceivability was so seriously impeded that they confronted a unimaginable test with overwhelming sadness. They had to cancel the hunt. The next day brought recharged trust as extra gas jumpers showed up from Madrid. The group set up a rule act basic expansion to help the 10 jumpers in advancing through the cavern. Regardless of these arrangements, their endeavors were fruitless in light of the cavern's constantly shady water, the dinky root conditions, a desire to die, and the gamble of entering the cavern's various branches considered too extraordinary. The quest for Antonio in the profundities of the Cueva del Agua developed into an extreme and huge scope activity, including north of 100 staff from different crisis administrations there. Revelation of Antonio's body denoted an overwhelming second. Quenching the last flashes of trust held by his friends and family, the activity to recover his body was tense with difficulties and intricacies. At first booked for 6:00 at night, the body recuperation must be EXP facilitated because of unfortunate coordination with taxpayer-driven organizations. The speed increase in this activity's course of events added a layer of power and chance. Individuals near the salvage endeavors express worries about this rushed methodology, since corners were sliced to make the time. Tragically, Antonio's body was never recuperated because of the outrageous dangers, and the recuperation was for all time cancelled. Unexpectedly, 2 other Antonios were keen on investigating the profundities of the puzzling cavern, neither of them had a connection to Antonio Pedro Martínez, who kicked the bucket in the cavern. Soon after his 41st birthday, Antonio Soler and Antonio Guerra, cherished, lifelong companions from a little Spanish town, longed for joining the esteemed Guardia Common, otherwise called the gas. They carried out to thorough actual preparation, concentrated on regulation and criminal brain science, to meet the powers' high norms. Cooperating, they defeated extreme tests and meetings. Their collaboration paid off, and they'd accomplished their deep-rooted objective of becoming trained and regarded individuals. From the Guardia Common Walk, 29th of 1996, was the arranged date for a particular group from the recognized Guardia, thoughtful to leave, determined to investigate the Cueva del Agua, the gas famous for their ability in oceanic hunt and salvage, was entrusted with a basic task. At the time, discussion had turned into the focal point of a warm discussion among the occupants. Core of this debate lay in the cavern's openness, ceaseless issue that split the local area between those clamoring for its returning and those upholding for its proceeded with conclusion, referring to somewhere safe worries and the refusal to expand salvage tasks for those thinking for even a moment to wander inside the cavern. Their plan was equivocal, yet full of intricacy, to dive into the cavern's profundities and learn its reasonableness for public investigation. This was no customary endeavor. It was a choice that bore the method of public security and logical research. Driving the endeavor were Antonio Soler and Antonio Guerra, who were handpicked for their outstanding expertise and mastery in cave plunging. Supporting them were a couple of jumpers that would remain beyond the cavern, yet were ready to enter on the off chance that there was some kind of crisis. The plunge plan was basic at this point, to be executed with the highest level of mindfulness. This was a very hazardous mission. But since of the Antonio's broad preparation, they weren't expecting an excessive number of issues yet. The jumpers were to test new procured hardware, which required specialized discernment and a natural comprehension of the stuff's subtleties. The initial segment of the endeavor was to infiltrate the cavern to a foreordained point, either 33% of their gas supply or the second crossroads of the exhibition tuple, roughly 600 FD or 200 m from the entry, whichever edge was arrived at first. As the Antonons dropped their speed, was purposeful, a sluggish swim through the water that permitted them to assume the spooky excellence of the cavern, the glow of the waters. An encouraging 82F or 28C added a strange quality to their campaign. After a careful plunge, the pair ended up in a display named Trouble, a famous cavern segment described by its choking limited passengers and a story weighed down with silt in cave jumping. You need to kick your flippers to the sides, assuming you go all over it or work up their sidew and cause a power outage, and this part was known for that it had numerous investigated courses, and the Antonios were most likely pondering going down a portion of these, yet these ways were to stay immaculate for the present, as the mission's boundaries were clear and severe infrequent. Line disturbances, an unsafe result of past stone falls, additionally confounded the misleading entries. Pushing ahead, they showed up at the pool tube, a sign that they were approaching the finish of their signed course. This drove them to the second T intersection, where they got a brief look at the VIS0 display's underlying segment, a sight that probably feeling better them, since this implied that they were close to the furthest limit of their expected plunge, and they could turn back. Notwithstanding having an overflow of 20 bars of gas and 2 extra minutes before their planned return, the circumstances considered a slight expansion. They then, at that point, chose to stretch past the conquered boundaries and remain into the neglected segments. Then they went on, yet they didn't understand. They were hitting a profundity of 688 FT or 210 m. The cavern sections were dishonest. By the way they were calculated, soon an adequate number of they understood how profound they were, and at that profundity, their gas was utilized a lot quicker. so they needed to start their revisitation of the cave entrance. An unexpected and terrifying acknowledgement probably struck them as they started their rising there. Once peaceful blue waters had changed into a dim fog, obfuscated with residue worked up during their plunge. This change probably cast a sorry excuse for ghastliness over their countenances, as this is a cavern jumper's most dreaded fear in any event, when cave jumpers prepared for complete loss of perceivability. Most concede that it is extreme, and in some cases, beyond difficult to get yourself away from a silted-out cave section, regardless of whether you have the plunge line unblemished. Assuming that it is cut off, you get no opportunity of getting out. Their apparently clear mission spiraled into a startling test as they explored the cavern's silted-out entries. Then their stuff introduced its most memorable obstruction, as monster breathed out air bubbles. These apparently harmless air pockets set off a fountain of rock and stone sections. After slamming into the whole roof, this peculiarity fundamentally diminished perceivability, enveloping the jumpers by a residue that confounded their journey. To find the right entry to lead them to the cave exit in the midst of this disrupting climate, a basic blunder was made. An off-base turn on the plunge line at a crucial intersection, where a left go would lead them towards the entry they dreaded. Right, a choice credited to the disorientating thickness of the water. This stumble set them on an accidental way, driving them from their expected course. After roughly 10 minutes, they ended up at the display Dira entrance, a tight section, not piece of their arranged course. Understanding their slip-up, they confronted a basic choice rationale, directed a revisitation of the broad entry of exhibitions, getting back to the pool of troops and 606 FT or 185 M to reconnect with the display of disagreement anyway, in a bewildering and unsafe decision driven maybe by distress. As their air supply dwindled, they pushed forward looking for a substitute exit, or some way or another finding one of the air pockets. This choice denoted their second basic blunder. Their desire for finding one more way out pushed them more profound into the cavern's maze organization. They went on through the tight sections, plunging to 820 feet or 250 m, where perceivability was decreased to simple crawls. In this desperate circumstance, they wildly looked for any indication of a leave, a flicker of light that could offer salvation. However, the cavern was unforgiving, introducing just dark residue-loaded waters. Continuing off course for an additional 15 minutes, they arrived at an impasse. No further associations or pathways introduced themselves, driving them in a condition of significant isolation and despair at an overwhelming profundity, where the different lights just hardly entered the severe dimness. The pair ended up overwhelmed in a practically complete absence of perceivability. The two companions' circumstance became progressively dangerous as they looked for a leave, their expectations diminishing as time passes. Following 10 extra minutes of exploring this submerged labyrinth, they defied an obvious reality. Their air tanks were essentially unfilled. This acknowledgement probably hit them with a significant feeling of segregation. With their air supply alarmingly low, a simple 5 minutes staying, the pair were constrained to defy the certainty of their circumstance. They had no real option except to start a wary retreat, backtracking their means along the display line for one more 150 FT or 50 M in a frantic bid to find their direction to an air pocket. A chilling second unfurled. Antonio Care saw a sight that sickened him. The light from Antonio Gar's spotlight was quickly decreasing in a tragic new development. Antonio Guo had surrendered to hypoxia, the absence of adequate air making him pass out, his structure vanishing into the dim profundities. Antonio Carce confronted a troubling acknowledgement in the unpleasant quiet of the Cueva Del Agua. The heaviness of his circumstance overwhelmed him with pounding power. Alone in the profundities, he comprehended his destiny could reflect that of his long-lasting companion. Antonio Guo, frantic and decided he pushed on swimming to another section over the ground. The surface group from the GIA Spain Submerged Search and Salvage Unit had been tense. They were hanging tight for any indication of the jumpers. When an hour had passed without something from them, the request was given: DS send in, look for their missing confidants. The earnestness of the mission was clear, consistently counted. The help jumpers furnished with their stuff left on their central goal. In the wake of directing careful gear checks, they occurred to the water them, zeroed in on the overwhelming errand ahead anyway. The cavern's perceivability conditions were as yet horrendous. The water's turbidity, a thick soup of residue and sediment, confined their advancement to only 90 ft, or 30 m, as time ticked away. The expectation of seeing as the jumpers alive blurred. Night fell, creating a shaded area over the salvage endeavors. A great sending of heroes, trauma centers, volunteers, and assets was made to support the hunt. The underlying pursuit, set apart by its ad-lib in high gamble, yielded no outcomes and must be suspended at this point. The hero endeavors didn't yield constantly. The group continued, gripping to the slightest bit of trust that the jumpers could have found shelter in an air pocket. This activity united a portion of Spain's most exceptionally talented jumpers, including specialists from the naval force, plunging place for 35 Aru days. These specialists worked eagerly, exploring the cavern's difficult circumstances. The activity was set apart by a fastidious, calculated approach, with each colleague contributing their skill and experience, determinedly chasing after conclusion. At long last, on May 1, 1996, 34 days after the portentous plunge, the activity arrived at a solemn achievement. The dead collection of Antonio Guerra was found around 600 ft, or 95 m, from the cavern's entry. The next day, in a continuation of the thorough endeavors, their group found the collection of Antonio Soler, found 311 ft, or 95 m, from the entry of similar exhibition. His body, very much like his companion, was in the high-level condition of disintegration. The high temperature of the water had accelerated the cycle, adding one more layer of intricacy to the body. Recuperation activity, after numerous passings in this cavern, plaques were set close to the cavern's entry. Regarding the misfortune, specialists demand the cavern to be utilized for science, not the travel industry. Try today. A nearby gathering, Cueva Del Agua, limit 10,000 investigates it, planning to connect it with close-by caverns to arrive at 1,000 m profound. I need to bless your heart.